Hello there. Welcome to Just the Discs. We talk about Blu-rays here and 4Ks, and this is a really exciting month and an exciting year for me because I've gotten not one but two of my very favorite films on 4K. One of them, of course, is Rio Bravo. Very nice. And the other one, which is huge to me, and which we'd been waiting a really long time, even for a Blu-ray, but it, leapfrogged that. We get a Blu-ray, but we also get a 4K, and that is Criterion's new edition of After Hours. And this happens to be my personal favorite Martin Scorsese film, and I think it is just one of those. On Pure Cinema, we call it a handshake movie. It's the kind of movie that you find out that somebody else is a fan of it, and immediately you have sort of this connection. You kind of get each other. Because this movie is just really interesting. It's incredibly stylishly done, shot by the great Michael Ballhaus. It has a very, I think, dark, but I find deeply satisfying sense of humor to it. And I don't know, it's just really great. It's, the story of a word processor named Paul Hackett. Paul Hackett is played by Griffin Dunn, who's one of the producers on the movie, along with Amy Robinson, part of their Double Play Productions string of films. And there are a lot of great and interesting films there. They started as Triple Play, and they made Chilly Scenes of Winter, and they would go on to make things like Baby It's You right before this, which is one of my favorite, coming-of-age sort of romance movies, John Sayles film. And then this is their follow-up to that. So two really great movies. I also think this is interesting because this word processor is basically sent into sort of a descent into some version of hell, wherein he meets a woman in a diner, more or less, played by Rosanna Arquette, and they hit it off, connecting over a book he's reading. He's reading Tropic of Cancer, and they make this connection, and he gets her phone number, and he decides, what the heck, I'm going to call her and see if we can hang out tonight, even though it's already late. It's a weeknight. He's got to be to work in the morning. And she, is interested and wants him to come downtown to Soho. And in doing so, there really is like this great entry into a dark world, and everything goes wrong for him from then on out. And he meets a huge variety of colorful characters, played by a lot of great character actors, Catherine O'Hara, Terry Garr, the list goes on and on. Linda Fiorentino. It's really a truly wonderful cast. John Hurd plays a bartender that really wants to help him out, and has a connection to something that happens later. There's lots of great connections. It's a really neat story. It's a great script. It's written by Joe Minion, and apparently was originally called Lies, and was a thesis script, something he wrote in college. And again, another thing I find interesting about this movie, and I think something that people forget about now, was that Martin Scorsese in 1984, 85, was at a real low point of his career. He had great success in the 1970s with Taxi Driver and then Raging Bull. New York, New York, not so much. But then he made King of Comedy, which, despite how it looks like a relatively simple to make film, was very difficult for Scorsese to do. And on top of that, it's one of my favorite movies of his. It's maybe my number 2 or 3 of his films. On top of that, it flopped really bad. And I think it's a great movie, but it's a movie that's found its audience over the years and did not find it at the time. So Marty himself tells the story within the features of this about moving to Tribeca, getting a loft in Tribeca, which I think is near Soho. I could be wrong. But that he was really not happy there. And so this was kind of, he could really relate to this character in a lot of ways. And he was sort of returning to the city, living in the city with the noise of the city, the construction. He just said there was a lot of things that made him very miserable when he was living, and he couldn't afford to get a new place because he was broke. And so he's really at a low point, like I said, and he gets sent this script by his lawyer, who happens to be the shared lawyer between he and Griffin Dunne and Amy Robinson, and he really responds to it and decides he wants to make it. And he sees it as something of a rebirth of himself as a filmmaker. You know, kind of having to teach himself to make movies quickly and cheaply as he had when he started, you know, working nights. He talks about something like Taxi Driver was like 45 days of night shooting, or 45 days of night and day shooting, versus 100 days for New York, and Raging Bull. I mean, that's 2 times as long. That's just a really extended shoot. Obviously more expensive. You're doubling your budget when you go, because days equals a lot of money. So he just was really in a place where, and I forgot I buried the lead. The most important thing that really crushed him was he had been developing Last Temptation of Christ, which was like one of his real big pet projects, and had even gone as far as, I think, looking for locations. This is circa 1983, right around King of Comedy. And at the last minute, the plug gets pulled. It's canceled. The movie's completely gone. And he's sort of persona non grata. And so finding this script and talking to Griffin Dunne and deciding that he wanted to make it was really something that he hoped would be rejuvenating. And it was. And using Michael Ballhaus for the first time, he would use him a bunch. Goodfellas, a whole bunch of other films, Age of Innocence. One of the great cinematographers ever. But a really quick, with lighting DP. Just somebody who could really run and gun. Had worked with Fassbinder and had worked with lower budgets and was just a great fit for this. But this is the beginning of their collaboration, which becomes one of the great, you know, cinematographer-director collaborations, I think, ever. But yeah, so it's it's just a really great moment for him to ultimately start to find his way back to filmmaking, and he ends up really loving it and really getting into it, and I think the energy and the enthusiasm can be felt in the filmmaking. It's just like just about every shot is on a dolly. I mean, that's, you know, a lot of Scorsese films, but it's just really doing a lot of the stuff he did. Like if you look at it and you look at something like Mean Streets, you can see that same thing of like just about every shot on a dolly. Every shot has a little bit of a move to it, and it really brings you in, you know? But yeah, it's just a delightful film. And I always like to like show off this. These are people who love this movie. So there's a bit of a running joke in the movie about a plaster of Paris bagel and cream cheese paperweight, and both the discs, the 4K and the Blu-ray, are in the shape and design of that. And then the booklet has this hand-drawn flyer. This man is a burglar. If you see him, stop him, which is another joke from the movie, which I think is great and a nice touch. You know, I love it when they do this. And then there's some other stuff in the inner artwork that also lines up with things that you like about the movie. So this has an essay by Sheila O'Malley. I'll just read like the first paragraph. It's called No Exit, and it says, in Martin Scorsese's After Hours, 1985, you never forget the presence of the camera. It careens forward on the diagonal in the opening scene, making a beeline for Paul Hackett, Griffin Dunne, a word processor in a Manhattan office. The shot is alarming. You expect to hear chairs clattering out of the way or people shouting as they're hit. As Paul trains a new employee at his desk, that employee played by Bronson Pinchot, A woman walking past catches his eye, and the camera follows her, suggesting that she's enormously important. But then Paul's gaze moves on, and the camera does too. The woman wasn't important after all. From this early point in the film, Scorsese and cinematographer Michael Ballhaus, a frequent collaborator of Rainer Werner Fassbinder's, make it impossible for viewers to get their bearings. When everything is important but nothing is understood, the world is a maddening place. Paul is dragged deeper and deeper into his bewilderment until Soho, the edgy downtown neighborhood located directly south of Houston Street, hence the name, where he goes looking for a night adventure, becomes a funhouse mirror reflecting illusory landscape roots. The film's disorienting mix of dread and humor evokes Paul's mental state. Scorsese envisioned After Hours as a parody of a film noir and also a parody of a thriller, and he beckons us with genre tropes that imply meaning but ultimately signify nothing, while also deploying humor as a device, a game. As he saw it, what lies beneath the laughter, though, are primal feelings that most adults don't want to express aloud. Everything is so unfair. The deck is stacked against me. Why can't I catch a break? So that's a great start to that essay. So Criterion's really done right by this movie in terms of the transfer looks as good as I've ever seen it. There are certain scenes that even have a different pallor. There's a specific bathroom scene with a man on the wall, very famous shot, that had more of a greenish tone that suddenly is gone, and I don't mind it. It's just, it looks really, really good. This is a new 4K digital restoration approved by editor Thelma Schoonmaker with uncompressed binaural soundtrack. So now we have a commentary that includes Scorsese. It includes Thelma Schoonmaker, DP Michael Ballhaus, actor Griffin Dunne, and producer Amy Robinson. And he goes into a lot of what I've been talking about, just that state of mind he was in, and all the others talk about sort of the making of the film. It's a great commentary. I love Scorsese commentaries in general. I find them to be some of the best out there. I could listen to him talk about anything. They've added a new interview between Martin Scorsese and Fran Lebowitz, the writer, and it's almost 20 minutes long. And she interviews him about living in New York City in the 80s and what he captured of that era in After Hours. And he talks about seeing the script and the things he responded to about it, where he was in his career, that low point stuff I was talking about, how he'd been living in Tribeca, how the script felt like an anxiety dream. They talk about the cab scene, which is as he's going to Soho, he's just in this cab that's just whipping through the street, and, you know, something bad happens along the way. And Scorsese talked about that sort of thing actually happening to him, even down to this flamenco music, which is playing in the car. It's great. How shooting at night in New York, that part of New York City at the time was empty, but it was like a studio backlot, and it was kind of lonely. There were no bars or bakeries. They talk about the character and his general politeness in the face of all kinds of adversity, and how After Hours led to Color of Money, which also he made quickly and came in under budget, and why the film continues to endure and be popular now. It's a really great and funny conversation. I really enjoyed it. Then we have Filming Your Life, the Making After Hours. This is a 2004 documentary, I think was ported over from the DVD, that also includes Scorsese, Griffin Dunne, Amy Robinson, Thelma Schoonmaker. It's almost 19 minutes. And again, a lot of the same territory is covered, but there's different anecdotes. There's a great anecdote about Griffin Dunne and Amy Robinson getting Tim Burton initially attached to the script after they had reached out to Scorsese and hadn't heard anything. And then finding out that Scorsese was interested, and Tim Burton gracefully, once he had heard that, bowing out of the project. Now, I would be very interested to see an After Hours-esque movie from Tim Burton, but I'm glad that he had the wherewithal and the grace to step back and say, you know what, I'm going to let Scorsese direct this movie. So that's a great story. But yeah, it goes into a lot of the same kind of stuff, where he's at in his career, all that. And Griffin Dunne tells this great story, which is one of my favorite stories of the movie, about a scene where he has to go to this place called Club Berlin. He's actually going back there for the second time. And he wanted to do something. He wanted to experiment with something about getting his head and his energy and his anxiety in the right place. And he asked Marty if they could tail slate the scene, which means, they're not going to call action at the beginning. They're going to call the slate at the end so they can sync it from the end, because he wanted to try something. So he walks out the door of the set, runs down the block and around the corner, I think, to a bar. Goes into the bar, says, drinks for everyone, at the end of the bar. He's buying drinks for the whole bar. Everybody's like, yeah, thanks, yay. And just as he's the bartender turns and is about to ask him to pay, he runs out of the bar. And the bartender's like, hey, stop that guy. Very much like a scene from the movie. And I think in the back of his head, Griffin Dunne knows that the assistant directors will probably settle the tab and it'll be fine. But it allowed him that frantic energy. And so he runs full bore back to the set, out of that situation, and comes into the scene and does the scene. And then they tail slate it. And I just think that's brilliant. I think it's such a great way to get yourself into the headspace of the character that you needed. And he really does a wonderful job of keeping you in that anxiety-filled headspace. There's just one great scene after another of bad things happening to him. One of my favorites is him trying to get on the subway and finding out that the fare has gone up, and the guy behind the window will not give him a token because he claims, he might get drunk at a party and tell somebody about it and lose his job. Anyway, just lots of silly New York stuff, but I just adore it. I just adore the movie and the journey that he goes on. Okay, so really nice, it's an old feature, but it goes well with the disc. There's a new featurette here called The Look of After Hours, which features new audio interviews with the costume designer Rita Ryak and production designer Jeffrey Townsend, and it's illustrated with film clips, production stills, and ephemera from the film. It's about 18 minutes, and it's really interesting because they start to talk about things like how there are things in almost every shot that are not explained and that you never get an answer to. And that's the whole film is sort of enigmatic in that way. And he points out a few things that I think are really interesting. This is the production designer, Jeffrey Townsend. And he also talks about his working relationship with Michael Ballhaus. And apparently they were a team and they had worked together on some stuff, including Baby It's You, which is part of how I think they got, slid into this movie, which is kind of neat. He talks about Ballhaus's approach to lighting and mostly just emphasizing what's already there in this really great way. It's really neat to hear that stuff. And then they just point out lots of little details about costumes. They tell some behind-the-scenes stories about the costuming and the production, and there's just a lot of stuff in here that I had missed, and I've seen this movie many, many times. So it's just kind of delightful to have somebody point your eye to certain things and give you a little bit of backstory to certain things that you didn't know, that you wouldn't know because you weren't part of the production. So a really fantastic disc. I couldn't be happier with it. Like I said, it looks gorgeous in 4K. Only the commentary is available as part of the 4K, and then the rest of the features are on the Blu-ray. But, A+. I'm so happy to have this on Blu-ray and 4K now. Just really made my year. Okay, my next 4K, one more to talk about, is an equally great movie. This one has come out on Blu-ray. I think only through one of the film noir, the neo-noir box sets from Imprint Films. And so it's been out, but this has there's not a lot in terms of features, I can't remember if I should have compared my Blu-ray to this in terms of what the differences are, but there's not a lot of new features, but that's okay. Because this movie also looks very, very good in 4K. It was only on Blu-ray as part of that Imprint set, which is pretty expensive, so I'm sure a lot of people didn't get it, if they were just fans of this film. But this film came out in 1992, and it's a really great noir thriller directed by the great Carl Franklin. And it comes out at this moment of some really amazing independent cinema that was sort of popping off in the U.S. at the time. It's part of like this indie boom almost that was happening with movies like Reservoir Dogs, Gas Food Lodging, Clerks, etc. So many interesting filmmaking voices and filmmakers finding a platform back then and really taking off. I think in part because of, video, and you could sell a movie on its video sales and video rental. And so there was really a lot more room to make movies cheaply and get them out to people. And there was an interest. There was a great interest in art house cinema at this time. I was, in college at this time, and it was really a neat period in terms of these kind of films. And we still see this to this day, but I just don't feel like you're getting the studio distribution support that you did in the same way. I don't know. It was just like, it was a big deal. And this movie, I think, is one of the key films of that period. And the idea is basically that you have the story of two ex-cons played by Billy Bob Thornton and Michael Beach. Billy Bob Thornton is a co-writer of this script. And they are with, one of them has a girlfriend, that's Billy Bob, played by Cinda Williams, who is just beautiful and fantastic in this movie. She really has this incredible way of making things feel intimate in this way, that I can't really even describe. Like the camera is really not there, and she's just, it's really wonderful what she does. So anyway, the three of them get wind of, I guess, a big cachet of drugs and money in LA, and they go looking for it. And both the Billy Bob and the Michael Beach characters are not particularly stable guys. They're very violent guys. And by the time they're finished, they have horribly murdered 6 people in pursuit of this money and drugs. And they get it, but not as much as they thought. But now they got to get out of town. And so they do bust out of LA. And then the cops get involved. There's 2 detectives called Cole and McFeely, played by Jim Metzler and Earl Billings. And these guys have to figure out where they're going, and they have to try and catch them. And through a good break, they are able to figure out that they may be headed to, I believe, Star City, Arkansas. And so then they have to coordinate with the local sheriff there, who is played wonderfully by Bill Paxton. Now, this guy is a very small-town sheriff, kind of a hick, a bit racist, but a good-hearted person generally, and very excited to be involved with a big city investigation. They don't, as he says to them on the phone, they don't get many cases like this in Star City. So what you think is going to be a big city meets country kind of investigation, and it is that to a degree. Like, the big city cops dealing with him are a bit condescending, and he seems a bit clumsy in his techniques as far as policing goes. But it ends up being way more complicated than that and more involved. And I'm not going to go into details because there's some really great revelations about it. But the way it goes down is much different than you'd expect. And it's just a really well-directed film. It's a film that, despite the violence, there is a real... Carl Franklin really believes in making the audience feel that violence. And I remember there's a great documentary series that he was involved in. There was one particular episode of it that was basically about the indie boom of this period, and Carl Franklin's interviewed, and he talks about the violence. He said something to the effect of, when someone dies in a movie, like, he wants you to feel the loss of humanity. He said, I still kind of remember exactly what he said. It was something like, there was a person in the room, that was here, that had hopes, that had dreams, that is gone now, and that loss should be felt. And that's sort of how he, conducts violence in his films. And he even goes so far as to, like, in cases of, like, some major characters being killed in this film or another film, he'll give the movie an actual moment of silence almost after that. as he feels should be done, and I think that's a really interesting approach because a lot of violence is just glossed over. He has a great story. He tells a couple times. He tells it in the commentary track, which is from the original 1999 DVD, which is a very good commentary track, that he goes into all kinds of detail about everything from the score to the locations to the casting to performances and all kinds of choices that he made filmmaking-wise, writing-wise, working with Billy Bob, all this stuff. But one thing he tells is a story about seeing Total Recall, I think, around the time he was thinking about this film, or making it, and how violent that film was and how the audience didn't really react to most of that violence, except there's a scene where a goldfish gets thrown or a goldfish bowl breaks or something, and the fish is flopping around the floor. And the audience really was affected by that. They gasped or something. And his idea was like, I want to make a film that the violence makes, or just the general tension makes people feel that way throughout. And so that's kind of one of his, modus operandi for this movie. And I think he does pull that off in some ways. So it's just a great victorious film of independent cinema of the early 1990s, and I love that it's getting this kind of treatment. Again, looks really wonderful in 4K. This is a 4K digital restoration approved by Carl Franklin. Again, this is one that has a UHD 4K disc and a Blu-ray disc, and it's I'll just read a little bit from, I like to read from the essay. In this case, the essay is by William Boyle. It's called Lock Things Up. The video store I frequented in my southern Brooklyn neighborhood as a kid had an unassuming generic name. I can't even remember what it was. International Video, maybe. But I called the guy, the place, Wolfman's, because the guy who owned it, the only one who ever manned the counter, looked like a part-time werewolf. Like he kept himself locked in the store so he didn't go buck wild, like he was always on the verge of transforming, hunched and hairy, his mouth foaming. The place was a holy institution to me. Starting at age 11, I'd go there at least 4 or 5 times a week, renting anything that looked appealing, drawn in by boxes where cool boxes I thought were cool, or actors I liked, or directors I admired. At some point in the junior high school, this would have been 1991, the burgeoning heyday of neo-noir, I rented Stephen Frears' The Grifters, which unlocked everything for me. I started reading Jim Thompson. I went back and watched many classic noir films as I could get my hands on. I was hooked. I vividly remember picking up One False Move, 92, for the first time, and that cover, that box cover, Cinda Williams' face over a sunset, shootout, a beater car, and a police cruiser framing 4 shadowy figures, 3 on one side taking position against the cop, one who looks to be freshly shot, a scene that's different from what happens in the film, and the title in fat white font, a 4-star blurb from Gene Siskel's review above, a brilliant detective thriller. It was a beautiful time for me, a time of wonder and discovery. I wasn't reading reviews. No one was telling me what I had to see. I was the only person in my family interested in movies, and my friends who only ever wanted to watch what was showing at multiplexes. I rented One False Move that day. I went home. I loaded it in the VCR. I knew Bill Paxton from Weird Science, Aliens, and Near Dark, but his was the only familiar face. The first viewing blew me away. The urgency and the rawness, the complexity of the characters. Back then, I couldn't articulate what I was reacting to, but what I can say now, all these years later, having written several novels that are crime dramas, is that I'm most drawn to stories that are rooted in character and place with deep psychological undercurrents. In my personal canon, One False Move is the quintessential example of what I respond to within genre. For my money, it's a perfect crime movie infused with desperate energy and moral ambiguity, one that doesn't miss a beat, one whose effects linger and deepen. So that's a great setup for this film. Now, as I said, not a lot of features here. You get the commentary track from Carl Franklin from 99. I still think it's great. I'm glad it's included here. They have added one other feature, and that is a new conversation between Carl Franklin and co-writer actor Billy Bob Thornton. And that is about 27 and a half minutes. And it's a neat conversation. I have to admit, I was momentarily distracted by the fact that Billy Bob he's wearing like a light turquoise bandana with a sort of fedora over it with the brim pushed up. And it just looks odd. It just looks like somebody didn't say, hey, Billy Bob, maybe not for this interview. I don't know. But anyway, it's definitely something it feels like he would wear. And at a point, I'm just like, he doesn't care what people think of how he looks. And that's probably the way he dresses. But anyway, great chat. Like I said, they talk about the origins of Billy Bob and Tom Epperson, his co-writer on this script, how they got started in screenwriting, how the first script they sold led them to get this cop as a technical advisor, and how that cop told them about a police officer very much like the Dale Hurricane character Bill Paxton plays in this film. And he also told them about a multiple homicide thing that had happened in LA, and that was sort of the beginning of the idea for this script. And Billy Bob talks about coming across Carl Franklin via his short film Punk from 1986, which I really want to see. I could not track down. If anybody can tell me where I can see it, I would love to check it out, because I'm a big Carl Franklin fan, and for whatever reason, I have not been able to see this one yet. And it was clearly something that impacted Billy Bob in a big way, in terms of wanting to get him involved in this movie. They talk about Carl Franklin's approach to directing and how he was an actor. His approach seems more grounded and direct, saying things like, try it a little more angry this time, that kind of direction, as opposed to trying to talk about character and what kind of person is this guy, et cetera, et cetera. In the moment, Billy Bob is saying that kind of direction, the more nuts and bolts, try it a little more angry this time or whatever, is much more helpful, and that Carl's approach is really great like that. And Franklin talks about how he wants to try and create a space for actors where they feel comfortable enough to make the scary choice, do the thing that they think, that maybe is a little more vulnerable, maybe it's a wilder choice or whatever, and then allow them themselves to sort of pull back, as opposed to encouraging them to censor themselves and not giving them the opportunity to have those great moments. And I think that's really admirable. And I know it must be a tough thing to do, and it must be a difficult environment to set up, the kind of trust that an actor and director must have to allow them to make the more bold choices, So I love that stuff. They talk about the casting of Bill Paxton, who they had wanted from the get-go, but how they had to offer the film to other actors like Tim Robbins and Jeff Daniels, who both passed. And thankfully they came back to Bill Paxton. I do think it's one of his best performances that he's ever given. And it's really what seems like kind of a cliched character stereotype really goes a lot deeper and becomes much more affecting than you might even expect by the end. That's one of the things I love about the movie. They talk about Cinda Williams and the things she does as an actor. Apparently she and Billy Bob got married after this, I think. Very short-lived marriage, but she's really good in this movie, and I don't, off the top of my head, know enough other films that she's been in, but she really helps anchor the movie. Michael Beach, as the other, ex-con, is a very effective, quiet sociopath, just really dark and calm and scary in that way. And the three of them really play well off each other and create a great imbalance, a great tension. But yeah, it's a really wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. The only thing I'll point out that I just thought was funny, because I'm not used to Criterion making mistakes, is at one point Billy Bob talks about Carl Franklin, again, being an actor, and they show a quick frame of him with Roddy McDowall, and the caption says, "Fantastic Voyage, 1977. I'm like, Fantastic Voyage? What? It's not the 1966 movie. What is that? So I look up Fantastic Voyage 77, nothing comes up, but what does come up is a series called The Fantastic Journey from 77 that Carl Franklin was in, which I'd like to check out. But I did think it was odd that Criterion made a mistake and nobody corrected that at any point, which is too bad. But like I said, really great interview. Despite there only being that commentary in this interview, I really still feel like the disc is, giving you tons of great information about filmmaking. Carl Franklin is very forthcoming about a lot of the things he's doing and the choices he's making and why he's making them, in that commentary especially. And I really do feel like it's one of those that you can learn a whole lot from. So very, very excited to have this film on 4K and Blu-ray from Criterion. Highly recommended, of course, as is After Hours, one of my favorite films of all time. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.